focus tonight on trying to solve many of the problems that we see happening in the design world. So the title of this talk is Designing Functional Usable Accessibility. I'm very active on social media, so you can see my Twitter handle at @Kurdi at the bottom left of the screen. And Designable Environments is also on Twitter at @TweetDesignable. I'm also on LinkedIn, where I post more detailed information because, there's not a character count. I want to start with a question, which is a fundamental question. If design is problem solving, it's about creating beautiful things, but it's really about problem solving. And so the fundamental question, who are we designing for, is something most of our design education doesn't really tackle. It focuses more on, what do you think about design? What are you expressing through design? So I loved this quote from Neil Milliken, who is one of the speakers at A11Y Toronto last year. And his quote talks about, that I have on the screen here, says, "Poor accessibility is an externality of the production and planning process. It's a kind of pollution and it's unnecessary." And Neil Milliken's also on Twitter at Neil, Milliken. And the picture beside his quote is a woman on an exterior trail through the woods trying to get through a gate that was not designed to fit her scooter. And so she's bending her head over to try to make that work. So if we're going to think about who are we designing for, then we also need to think about what exactly is a disability. If we're trying to create accessible and universal design, the international symbol of access is a person in a wheelchair. Unfortunately, when they designed this, it actually was just a wheelchair. And when people got upset, they, creatively put a head on the wheelchair. So that's not even a very good representation of a person who might be using a mobility device like a wheelchair. So we've seen also an evolution of this symbol, where we have the dynamic symbol of access that's been championed locally here in Ontario by the Forward movement. And they're also on social media at the Forward Move. But when you look at these symbols, you can see why people mistakenly really only focus on wheelchair users in most of our legislation and in most of our accessibility standards. We're not focusing on people with vision loss, people who are hard of hearing like myself, or who are deaf or deafened. We don't focus on autistic, amputees, people with multiple chemical sensitivities, neurodevelopmental, guide or service animal users, people who use scooters even are not included in that set of requirements. In fact, if we looked at the international symbols for accessibility, which I show at the bottom of the screen here, which includes the international symbol of access on the left, then the TTY symbol, then assistive listening, then neurodiversity, then interpreting, then a man with a white cane, then Braille, and then closed captioning. If somehow we had a much better symbol, maybe it would help people to think outside of the box or more inclusively about the full range of abilities and disabilities people have throughout their lives. And if we thought about who are we designing for, well, if we go back to 2017, the Canadian Survey on Disability, which looked at people 15 years and older, found that 22% of Canadians were self-identifying with at least one disability, which at the time for 15 and older represented 6.2 million people. If we took 22% of our population and forgot about the 15, then we were looking at 8 million people at least. And this report was done in 2017, so it's 3 years out of date, and it's relying on people self-identifying. So what about all those people who aren't sure? Do I really have a disability? I'm not going to say I have a disability. All of those reasons, perhaps this isn't actually 100% accurate. We suspect that it's probably far closer to 25%. And we know with a rapidly aging population, the need for accessibility accommodations, which not only helps everyone, is going to be much higher. So one of the problems we see with accessibility is so many people think that they're trying really hard and they're putting all this effort in, but as this picture suggests, unfortunately, because they are not taught properly about accessibility, how to ensure it's actually usable, they end up painting themselves into a corner. And this is when I usually get the frantic phone call, Thea, help. So it's the kind of thing that people get frustrated about because they don't know what they're doing. So for example, if someone's putting in a staircase and they're not thinking about the people who are going to be using those stairs and all the different needs they have, or how their needs are going to change in 20 years, think about how different you were 20 years ago. Think about your parents and how different they have become. So if we just looked at stairs and the kinds of mistakes people make with stairs, then we'll see something like this. So the text at the top left corner says confronting ableism. And what we see is a set of staircase that has a really good set of handrails on both sides that are color contrasted. Good, check. But the stairs themselves have this crazy pattern on the carpet, and it's really hard to see where each of the stairs ends. So this becomes a huge safety hazard. Don't want to do that. This is a lovely example that I found just this past summer where people were celebrating. Look at this beautiful staircase. This staircase looks like a waterfall. It does have a handrail on one side, but because the other side is flowing down and into it, the risers change height. Can you imagine if you were drunk trying to come down these stairs? Or imagine how scary it would be to have a child in this house. So, you know, purpose built, do what you want with your house. But if you thought about the people who come visit your house, or again, as your needs change, if you have a bad head cold, you might not find that these stairs are actually very safe. So beautiful, but safe? No. Or how about this beauty? Someone put in a very steep staircase outside of a building, and then suddenly realized there was no accessible access down to the platform. I wish I could hear you laughing because it's just so bad. They put in a ramp immediately next to the stair that follows exactly the slope of the stair, which is far too steep. And then very helpfully put the international symbol of access in blue sign on this ramp. I think somebody could get hurt really badly on this. So obviously you don't want to be doing that. And then this one, oh, I call this the ribbon stair. This is, again, something I just saw this summer that all of these designers were getting all excited about. Look at how beautiful this stair is. This stair literally looks like a folded ribbon. And the way to walk up the stair is you have to put your left foot on the correct step, and then your right foot on the other step. And if you tried to do it in the wrong order, you would fall down. And one side of it, just like we saw with the waterfall steps, doesn't have any handrails or guards. So again, if you slipped, you would fall off of this. So imagine kids coming in here and thinking, wow, look at this great thing I can play on, and how badly they could get hurt, or your mother or grandmother trying to navigate these stairs. So just because you can do something doesn't make it a good idea, or maybe even smart, responsible, or sustainable as the user's needs change. So great news. Getting accessibility right, getting universal design right is not rocket science. I like to emphasize that for people. You just have to spend some time thinking about it. In fact, I would say getting accessibility right is like making a recipe. But that sounds like a strange thing to say. So let me walk you through this analogy. Oftentimes when people are dealing with accessibility and they haven't really thought about it, they kind of treat it the same way we treat icing on a cake. So we might get people who are very generous after they finish making the cake with applying lots of icing to the cake. So here we see a picture with lots of thick layer of icing all over the top of the cake. But other people might think, you know what, for this cake, I want to have a very thin layer of icing and maybe some jam in the middle instead of icing. Wouldn't that be delicious? Or we get people who don't want to have any icing at all and just use some powdered sugar over the top. Right? So this is sort of the experience we see with accessibility in design and thinking about how do we actually make it work. Obviously, this is far too discretionary and not useful. In fact, good, solid design that works for people over a lifetime of changing needs and abilities means accessibility and universal design principles need to be one of the fundamental ingredients of solid design. Imagine if you tried to make a cake without the sugar. Or if you've had Montreal bagel, the first time I had a Montreal bagel, I tasted the bagel and I thought there's something wrong with this bagel because Montreal bagels don't have salt, and I was used to bagels with salt. So Montreal bagels are a different thing, but they don't have salt in them. So for example, if you ask someone to make banana bread, and what we see here in this picture is a beautiful brown loaf of brown banana bread with, in this case, it looks like it's even got some nuts in it, and someone's cut it to some delicious slices and put some butter on it. But if you haven't been taught the recipe for banana bread and following the steps for banana bread, if, for example, you were only taught how to make a baguette, then if someone said to you, I would like banana bread, you might produce something like this. And what we see here is a loaf of regular bread where somebody's cut slices in and jammed whole unpeeled bananas into them. So unfortunately, I wish I could tell you I'm getting a lot of the stuff people present to me proudly saying, look, it's accessible, is very much like this bread with banana sticking out of it. So solution, learn and follow the recipe. And just like we said today, we're going to be collecting a whole set of resources. Here's my first. The City of Mississauga Facility Accessibility Design Standards has a whole recipe book full of, it's a cookbook essentially for accessibility, full of all of the different elements that make up a building and all of the accessibility ingredients that you're going to need to make it successful. The biggest problem people get is they get a cookbook like this, or they get a resource like this, and they cherry pick their way through it instead of following it. So for example, when I was teaching my son how to cook, I needed to make sure he understood what add an onion to the recipe meant. It didn't mean add an unpeeled onion, or it didn't mean peel an onion and cut it in half and just have 2 halves of onion. Dicing the onion was important, and don't put in raw onion at the end, cook the onion before, right? So all of these different steps about cooking, I think, help people better understand what we mean about integrating accessibility right from the beginning. So today I wanted to focus quickly on 2 case studies. I know they're not very sexy, but they do have an element of just the complexity of when we're trying to get design right, how many steps and things to think about. So the first case study is going to be, how do I create accessible doors? And the second case study will be about, how do we create accessible parking? Now, I'm not going to have time to do everything, but we're going to go over some of the big mistakes we see people make. So case study 1, creating an accessible door. I'm going to try to focus on 9 of the many steps that go into making an accessible door actually work and actually be accessible and usable. So for example, if we looked at any one of the resources we have and read through the requirements for the door, you're going to see a whole list of things here. Here we have 12 different things that we're focusing on, 9 of which I'm going to talk about today. So in the interest of time, I'm not going to read this right now, but I will make this available accessibly later on. So the first one I want to focus on maneuvering space. Now, typically when you're thinking about a door, people don't think about the space that you need on either side of the door to approach the door and to use the door. Then that looks a little bit different on the pull side of the door than it does on the push side of the door. And then one of the reasons this is really important to start with is, for example, in exiting. If I have an exit, is there a clear floor space that's level on both sides of the door? If I have a meeting room that's perhaps pretty small, do I have space on either side of the door? And as you can see, we're also looking at, there's varying different, the chart on the bottom left that you're going to find in most of these requirements dictates the size of the clear floor space on either side of the door changes depending on if you're on the pull side or the push side and the type of door that you have. So again, you got to pay attention to the details. And as you're thinking about your doors, make sure your blocks, if you're designing, include maneuvering space so you don't screw this up. The second thing I wanted to focus on that I see people forgetting all of the time is the threshold of the door. This is at the floor level. Usually you see it as like a metal bar, or you see it as a piece of wood if it's in your home, or other different types of materials. And typically we look at this and see it as something that's separating the materials from one room to the other, the kitchen tiles to the carpet in the living room. But the threshold can make a door inaccessible if it creates too high a bump. So again, there's requirements here for how, if you can't make it flush, which of course you should be always trying to do, so it's not a tripping hazard and not a barrier, then make sure that it's less than 13 millimeters. And if it's greater than 6 millimeters, make sure that the edges are beveled so that wheels can go up and over them, or your foot can come up and over the rise. So thresholds are really important, and often, unfortunately, we don't see people making these adjustments or planning for them. Now, the third thing is, this is a really big deal because we've seen a change in the Ontario Building Code, and often, unfortunately, people are not aware of how to size a door. So if we wanted to do the clear width of the door, what we're talking about is measuring the door in a 90-degree open position, and we're measuring from the face of the door to the door stop. So on the picture on the right, I have all of those labels. So the size of the door itself is bigger than the clear width. So let's look at the math. How do we do this? And the green circle here is showing you the area here at the threshold where it is. So if we're calculating the clear width, so the first thing we can do is we can start with the size of the door, and then we subtract the door leaf, that's the thickness of the door in the 90-degree open position, and the door stop that's on the latch side when the door is closed. So if we looked at what the building code requires, the Ontario Building Code requires a clear width of 860 millimeters. How do we achieve that? Well, the standard door size that we see in most projects is 915. 915 door size minus the 40 for the door leaf minus the 50 for the door stop equals 825. Uh-oh. The typical 915 door that we've all been using in projects is too small and doesn't meet code requirements. So let's look at, if we wanted to calculate the door size by looking at the clear width plus the door leaf plus the door stop, so do it in reverse, then for Ontario Building Code, we'd start with the 860 clear width, and then we'd add the 40 for the door leaf and 50 for the door stop, and that would mean a door size of at least 950, depending on what you're doing with your hardware. But if you look at many of the resources that we're going to be providing, the accessibility requirements might look at having a clear door width of 950 or greater, depending on what the needs are. So again, if we did the math, we would take the 950, add the door leaf width of 40, add the door stop of 50, and that would mean the door size that you would be selecting for the project would have to be at least 1040. And again, that would depend on the hardware and other factors. But this is the way that people make this kind of mistake. So I want to empower people, do the math, it's not that hard, and we can get this right. Now, the other thing about doors is that a door is not very useful for people if it doesn't identify where it's going. So we want to make sure that we have good, solid door ID signage, right? Identification of the room that you're going into. You want to make sure it's consistently placed in the project, so which is important to be thinking about much earlier on than we normally think about signage. It needs to be on the latch side of the door. It has to be mounted between 1370 and 1500 above the door. Don't worry, it's all in the cookbooks, right? All these dimensions are there. And of course, it needs to be tactile. And we need to make sure that the tactile elements and raised elements and the braille are mounted at the correct height as well. But what we also need to consider, if we're looking really holistically at this, is what is the relationship of the signage to the power door operator? If I'm coming up, if I'm blind particularly, how do I see those things? And what about electronic signage? Everybody wants to use touchscreen kiosks. How do we do that? If we provided TVs or monitors or meeting sign-in at meeting rooms, how do we make that accessible as well? And here we see some examples of the technical drawings. On the left, we see the mounting height of the drawing and the type of information about the raised text. And on the right-hand side, from the CNIB's Clearing Our Path document, which is free, we see an example of high color contrast using mixed case text, but then below it, all caps text raised with braille on a ledge that's been angled upwards, so that if it's mounted a little bit too low, braille can be very hard to read. So by putting a ledge like this, we overcome that obstacle. I love this picture. Color contrast is really important for doors. For people with vision loss, or people who have a headache, or people who are just confused and a little bit lost, let's help them find the door. It doesn't have to be the whole door itself. It could be the door frame around the door. But we want to make sure that we have good color contrast between them. And we want to make sure that the door hardware provides good color contrast well. This picture here is pretty much a really good example of what not to do. It does do pretty good color contrast, but the black against white can read like a hole for someone with vision loss. The large graphics painted on the door, well, if you thought about it, don't never put signage on the door because the door moves. So if you're ever trying to look at signage on a door, it could smack you in the face. We can see that they've tried to be playful with these diagrams, which might seem like a really fun idea, but would that be recognizable to someone with cognitive disabilities or with vision loss? And then you can see that the door hardware, which is done in stainless steel, which, boy, everybody wants to do stainless steel because they're thinking about infection control. Stainless steel is not the best example. You can see each three of these doors are all using the same hardware, but you can see the door on the right has far more color contrast just because of the way the light's hitting it versus the two doors on the left. Now, power door operators are another big deal. So here we see this classic round 150 millimeter diameter push to open power door operator with the international symbol of access. That's the way it typically is done, and many legislation requirements required. What we so on this slide, I'm giving you two examples with red X's. Don't do this. So the one on the left is a very old-fashioned type of power door operator. So if you have something like this, it needs to be upgraded immediately. It's a very thin, tall push to open button. It's pretty small. It's actually smaller than the big round one, and it's usually mounted right next to the door, even if the door is coming right at you, which means you'll be hit. So it's just not big enough for people to see. The power door operator that we see on the right is something that a lot of people who are sighted got really excited about because it's a large square button instead of round, and it has a light around it that's showing green. Now that sounds like, and above it, it says, when it's occupied, the light will be red, and when it's green, the washroom is vacant. So the problem here is that if I'm colorblind, which a large number of men are, fewer women are, but again, if you're not paying attention or the light's streaming through the window, this could be hard to see. So it's not universally accessible. And one of the other things, just while I'm here, is, have you noticed none of these power door operators have Braille on them? If I have a push to lock and a push to open button, but I can't read push to open or push to lock, how would I know which of these buttons to be pushing? And then of course, there's this next type, which is a large round power door operator, but it's a touchless one. And again, during COVID, you can see everybody's thinking, oh, this is a much better solution. It says on the button, wave to open, and it has a hand with a waving on it. What does it not have? The international symbol of access, which is required for power door operators. And the problem with wave to open and why we've typically had to rip them out of many projects is because the sensor for how close do you have to be, how sensitive is the wave at, is often very challenging for people. And the problem too is that so many people are used to the push to open button is they push it anyway. And so they get frustrated. Why is it not working? It's become a big problem. So one of the other things we're thinking with power door operators is getting the location right. So it's not just enough to have the power door operator, is it mounted at the right hub above the floor? And what's interesting is our national building code, so here point number 2 says NBC, and the national building code actually requires 2 different power door operators, which you'll see in a second. And I'll show you what a vertical bar that achieves both sets of requirements can achieve as well. But the other consideration for power door operators is, how do you arrange a power door operator if you have room ID signage or if you have security? So all of these factors. So here we see the National Building Code requirements for 2 different power operators at 2 different heights. One, what we would call typically hand height, at the typical height we see in most power door operators. But the other, a lower one, much closer to the floor, would be a foot pedal height. So if you were quadriplegic or had limited mobility, you would be able to touch the lower button with your foot pad. One of the genius things about having a long bar, and we see this in many accessibility features, is that Anybody can use it and touch it with any part of their body, right? If you can't touch it with your hand, or you don't want to touch something with your hand, you can bump it with your hip. Or like this gentleman here, if you're using crutches, you can push the button with your crutches. It also works with the foot pedal. So much more versatile, much more usable. And then of course, we were talking about color contrast earlier. If you're going to be putting in these nice long bars, you can put them in with great color contrast. Unfortunately, still no braille. Then of course, location also has to think about making sure you're out of the way when the door is working. So if the door is going to swing towards you after you've pushed the button, you want to make sure there's enough clear floor space beside the door and in front of the power door operator so the door is not going to hit you. And you also need to make sure that it's at least 600 millimeters from a corner so that people can actually access the button and it's not located in a place that's unreachable. So again, for doors, thinking about security systems, you might have card systems, you might have keypads. You need to think about how color contrasted are they? Where are they located? Are they free of the door swing? Is there a relationship between the power door operator and the security system? Could the security system actually activate the power door operator? These are things that if you think through, aren't hard to do. But then of course, cane detectable guards are important. If you have a door that swings out into a large open patio where people might be shorelining along the wall or simply walking along the wall, you don't want the door to suddenly open and smack them in the face. So cane detectable guards are an important part of accessibility requirements. But once I put the guards in, I'm keeping people further away from the door. So now I have to rethink, where does the signage that tells me where this door goes to go? Where does the power door operator go? And where does the security access go? Because if I did it in an unthoughtful way, I might put it on the other side of the guard and people would have to push it and then run around the guard to get through the door. That doesn't work. And finally, step 9 of the many things that we talked about earlier is you want to make sure to use all of the elements. It must be intuitive how to use the door. It's got to be clearly identified and it needs to be easy to locate. Again, anything that you're asking people to use needs to be color contrasted. So for example, this designer put a lot of effort to create this door, and this is a COVID sign that we just saw. This is a small meeting room, so they have a large sign on the door that says only one person in the meeting room at a time. But what they've done is they haven't thought about how close that door is to the corner. They haven't provided any color contrast. You can see where the signage is on the hinge side of the door, not the latch side of the door. Lots of things, unfortunately, a mistake done in this design, which is completely avoidable. Study 2 is creating accessible parking. So again, 8 steps out of a many-step process. And you can see here, there's actually 14 typical things to be thinking about if you're going to do successful parking. So for example, the location of the accessible parking is the first thing you have to think about. You need to think about how close is it to the accessible entrance. You need to look at how visible is it at the site entrance. You want to talk about, is it attached to an accessible path of travel? And other things you have to think about are there any rest areas along the path? So anybody who's finding the path too far has a place to sit. And is there protection from wind, rain, and snow? And the image I have on the right here is taken from the the Americans with Disabilities Act guide, which has all kinds of great images that most of our designers find quite useful. And of course, what about public transit? Because not everybody drives to a site. So is your accessible parking blocking visibility to the building or access to the building? And then of course, passenger drop-offs are key as well, and work with accessible parking. You might drop somebody off and then go park. There are 3 types of accessible parking that we have as a part of most things in the Canadian standards. In our legislation, we have type A, which is van parking, type B, which is car accessible parking, and something called type C, which is limited mobility parking. And what differentiates it is that it doesn't have the access aisle, which we'll talk about in a second. But other types of proximity parking include parking for young families, horse and buggy, electric vehicles, or even golf carts. But the thing is, guess what? None of our legislation and even most of our accessibility standards don't talk about accessibility design provisions for any of these types of parking. So if you're a pregnant woman who's with a disability, the family parking that is available perhaps is not accessible. If you have an electric vehicle, none of the electric vehicle requirements include accessibility. That's bizarre. The number of spaces is included in our legislation. If you look at the legislation and compare it to some of the accessibility standards, you're going to see accessibility standards have more requirements. The number of limited mobility parking spaces is also available to us through these standards, and they're based on the total number of spaces in the parking lot. And again, if you think about the other things we've talked about, how would you space these appropriately and close to the building? Access aisles are an important part of making sure you can get from the parking spot up onto the passenger sidewalk. So for example, in this picture here, you usually see painted lines beside the accessible parking. And if people don't respect those painted lines, as we see in this picture, or if the size of the access aisles is not wide enough, how does somebody get onto the ramp for a side access to their van? Is there appropriate space? What about if the van had rear access? That takes us again to signage. Again, a lot of people don't think about all the different things we have with signage, but it includes vertical signage. And that means we've got to differentiate the type A, type B, and type C. We've got the pavement markings, we've got the directional signage, and we have availability signage. So you can see here on the right, the image says handicapped parking. Well, there's nothing handicapped about the parking. That's outdated information. So we wouldn't want to use that language, and that's not consistent with our legislative requirements even. So we see here 3 examples of vertical signage. The left one is the signage required by our AODA legislation. The center one is improving upon that using the accessibility. It's a slightly different sign, but what they've done is they've placed the sign in a concrete bollard, which is a post that's thick enough and strong enough that if a car was backing into this spot, they wouldn't be able to overhang the sidewalk and block it, and they wouldn't bend the sign over into the sidewalk, creating a hazard for people walking. And the sign on the right, a friend of mine took this in Toronto, showing a limited mobility choice. Of course, covered parking is a great solution for accessibility in a lot of ways, but again, are people thinking about the height clearance requirements for vans? Other considerations are the number of available parking spots. Depends on the type of building. If you're building for a hospital, perhaps the minimum number required by code is not suitable for the building type that you have. What about winter parking? Isn't underground parking an integral part of accessible parking options? And designated snow plowing areas on site are really important. Otherwise, guess where they dump the snow often? In the accessible parking spaces. Lighting for safety and signage. Safety, like things like duress stations. Are the duress stations accessible? Can you get to it on an accessible path to call for help if you need it? And then of course, additional signs, including things like site maps. So the picture that we have here on the right is from the Waterfoot Parking Garage in Burlington, and it includes the available number of regular parking spots and then how many accessible parking spots available too. So that's fantastic kind of information, great planning. So essentially, to be successful and integrate accessibility, we have to ask ourselves some questions. How do we accommodate other types of abilities beyond wheelchairs? And what are the impacts all year round? Try to design for worst case scenario weather, not best summer conditions. Are we designing for more than just wheelchairs? Are we only designing for ideal conditions? And is this universal design? Is this going to help everybody? In real life, the sum of the parts must be usable. You can't just put in a set of parking spaces, but oops, it's at the bottom of a 2-flight staircase. That's not helping anybody. In fact, this cartoon is fantastic, right? You have clients who don't really understand the user's needs, and in this case, parents who bought a mobile and hung it over the crib, showing fluffy animals. And the parents think this is a beautiful, amazing, I love it, mobile. But on the right, we see the baby's view, which is just the animal's butts. So unfortunately, far too often, because accessibility is really taught, because people haven't thought it through, the experience for users is pretty bad. So again, here's a list of resources. We're going to go back and talk about them. So I'm not going to spend any time here, but as they'll be added to the resource book. And of course, if you would like to reach me at any point, you can reach me at Designable Environments on my email, thea.kurdi@designable.ca. Our website is designable.ca. I'm on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram. Thank you very much, everyone.